The thunderous hooves of Preston Fletcher's stallion kicked up dust clouds against the crimson horizon as he rode toward Whisper Creek, a town that was just a speck on his weathered map and a whisper of hope in his aching heart. 10 years of wandering the untamed western frontier had carved lines into his face that made him look older than his 30 years, and the loneliness had settled into his bones like a winter chill that never quite thawed. It was 1875, and the promise of the West had begun to fade for many, but Preston still chased something he couldn't name across the rugged landscape. His ranch had failed after 3 seasons of drought. His partner had died of tuberculosis 2 winters past, and the last of his family back east had stopped writing letters altogether. The emptiness that followed him like a shadow had finally become too heavy to bear. The setting sun painted the distant buildings of Whisper Creek in gold as Preston approached. It wasn't much a dusty main street, a handful of wooden structures, and the promise of a hot meal and maybe, if he was lucky, a conversation that lasted more than the time it took to order whiskey. Might be different here, he muttered to himself, though years of disappointment had taught him otherwise. Still, something about this valley, nestled between rolling hills and the silver ribbon of Cottonwood River, stirred a forgotten feeling in his chest. He patted his horse's neck. "What do you say, Thunder? Worth a try?" The town emerged from the twilight as Preston rode in. Unlike the boom towns he'd passed through, Whisper Creek had an air of permanence, buildings with fresh paint, a church with a bell tower, women walking with baskets rather than standing in doorways with painted faces. A sign above the mercantile announced, "Established 1862, suggesting the town had survived the war and whatever hardships had come after. Preston tied Thunder outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, which despite its grand name was a modest establishment with a worn wooden porch and windows that glowed with lantern light. The familiar sounds of a piano and laughter drifted outside. He hesitated, suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance, his beard untrimmed, his clothes dusty, his eyes carrying the weight of too many lonely nights. "You coming in or just admiring the view?" A voice called from the doorway. Preston looked up to see a barrel-chested man with an impressive mustache watching him with amused eyes. "Just getting my bearings," Preston replied, stepping onto the porch. "New faces are always welcome, so long as they keep their shooting irons holstered and their tempers cool," the man said, extending a hand. "Samuel Miller, mayor of this fine establishment." Preston shook his hand, surprised by the warm welcome. "Preston Fletcher, just passing through." Mayor Miller chuckled. "That's what they all say? Come on in, son. First drinks on me." The interior of the saloon was cleaner than Preston had expected, with polished wood floors and tables occupied by a mix of locals rather than just card players and drifters. The piano player, an elderly man with nimble fingers, played a cheerful tune that seemed at odds with the melancholy that had settled in Preston's chest over the years. Preston followed the mayor to the bar, where a short man with spectacles served drinks with efficient movements. "Jake, this is Preston Fletcher. Give him our best whiskey, not that rot gut you serve the Cowboys on payday." Jake nodded, pouring amber liquid into a relatively clean glass. "Welcome to Whisper Creek, Mr. Fletcher. You looking for work or just rest?" Preston took the whiskey, savoring the burn as it went down. Hadn't thought that far ahead. Been ranching, but the drought took everything worth having. Mayor Miller nodded sympathetically. "We've had our share of hard times, but the last few years have been kind. There's work for a man who knows cattle. Parker's outfit is always looking for experienced hands." Preston was about to respond when the saloon door opened, sending a shaft of dying sunlight across the floor. A woman entered, and the room seemed to shift around her like water parting for a stone. She wasn't dressed like a saloon girl. Her simple blue dress was practical, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face free of paint. But something about her commanded attention without demanding it. "Katherine," the mayor called, "come meet our newest visitor." The woman approached with confident steps. Up close, Preston could see her eyes were a clear, intelligent green, and tiny lines at their corners suggested she smiled often. She was in her late 20s, he guessed, with a graceful strength in the way she carried herself. "Katherine Prescott, this is Preston Fletcher," the mayor said. "Mr. Fletcher, Katherine runs our schoolhouse and the lending library. Smartest person in town, though don't tell the doctor I said so. Katherine extended her hand, not in the dainty manner of Eastern ladies, but with the forthright grip of a woman used to being taken seriously. Welcome to Whisper Creek, Mr. Fletcher. Are you a reader? Preston shook her hand, suddenly conscious of the calluses on his palm. Not much time for books on the trail, madam, but I've always been partial to Mr. Twain's stories when I can get them. A smile warmed her face. Mark Twain? Then there's hope for you yet. The library is open Tuesdays and Thursdays if you're staying long enough to borrow a book. There was something in the way she spoke, direct but kind, her voice carrying notes of both strength and gentleness that made Preston want to hear more of it. I might just do that, he said, surprising himself with the realization that he was actually considering staying. Katherine nodded, then turned to Mayor Miller. Sam, I came to remind you about the town council meeting tomorrow. Mrs. Holbrook is determined to discuss the new schoolhouse roof again. As they talked, Preston found himself studying Katherine. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way of the painted ladies he'd encountered in his travels, but there was a vibrancy about her, an inner light that made it difficult to look away. When she laughed at something the mayor said, the sound rippled through the air like water over smooth stones. Mr. Fletcher, she said, turning back to him, if you're in need of a place to stay, Mrs. Wilson's boarding house has a room open. It's clean, and her cooking will put meat on those bones. Preston nodded, suddenly aware of how thin he'd become during his months on the trail. Much obliged for the recommendation, Miss Prescott. Katherine, please, she corrected him with a small smile. Miss Prescott makes me sound like an old spinster schoolteacher from New England. Aren't you a schoolteacher? Preston asked, the corner of his mouth lifting in what felt like his first genuine smile in months. Yes, but I'm from Illinois, and not nearly old enough to be considered a spinster just yet. Her eyes twinkled with mischief. At least I hope not. Mayor Miller laughed. Katherine came here 5 years ago to teach, and the town hasn't been the same since. She's dragged us kicking and screaming into civilization. Someone had to, she replied with good-natured exasperation. Wilson, a plump widow with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, showed him to a small but clean room on the second floor. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, she informed him. Laundry's extra, but I'll throw in your first week's worth since you look like you need it. Preston thanked her, setting his saddlebags on the bed. The room was simple: a bed, a washstand, a small desk, and a window overlooking the street, but it was more permanent than anywhere he'd slept in years. After washing off the trail dust and changing into his cleanest shirt, Preston returned to the main floor, where the smell of roast beef and fresh bread made his stomach growl. He joined 3 other boarders at the dining table: an elderly storekeeper, a young bank clerk, and a middle-aged woman who worked at the dressmaker's shop. The conversation flowed easily, with the others curious about the newcomer, but not intrusive. Preston found himself talking more than he had in months, sharing stories of his travels and listening to town gossip. For the first time and longer than he could remember, the ache of loneliness eased slightly. That night, lying in a real bed instead of on the hard ground, Preston stared at the ceiling and thought about Katherine Prescott's intelligent green eyes and the way she'd said his name as if it mattered. He thought about the mayor's mention of ranch work and the way the townspeople had accepted him without question. Just passing through, he reminded himself, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The next morning, Preston woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from downstairs. After breakfast, he walked Thunder to the livery stable, where the owner, a grizzled old-timer named Henry, offered him a fair price for boarding the horse. Thinking of staying a while? Henry asked as he ran a knowledgeable hand down Thunder's leg. Maybe a few days, Preston said noncommittally. Henry nodded, unsurprised. Town has a way of keeping folks. I came through in '62 planning to rest for a night. Been here 13 years now. Preston spent the morning walking through Whisper Creek, taking stock of the town. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance: a main street with 2 cross streets, a schoolhouse, church, general store, bank, doctor's office, telegraph office, blacksmith, 2 saloons, and various shops. There was an air of prosperity about it, but not the frantic, temporary wealth of mining towns he'd seen rise and fall. As he passed the schoolhouse, he heard children's voices reciting multiplication tables, and then Catherine's voice gently correcting a mistake. He slowed his pace, listening to the patient warmth in her tone. "Mr. Fletcher." The voice came from behind him. Preston turned to see Mayor Miller waving from across the street. "Just the man I wanted to see." The mayor crossed to join him. "I spoke with James Parker this morning. He's looking for a foreman for his North Range, someone who knows cattle and can manage men. Told him about your ranching experience." Preston frowned. "I appreciate the thought, but I didn't say I was looking to stay." "No, you didn't," Miller agreed easily. "But a man doesn't ride into town with everything he owns in his saddlebags unless he's looking for something. Parker's a good man, pays fair wages, and the North Range is some of the best grazing land in the county. At least talk to him." Preston hesitated, then nodded. "I'll talk to him. No promises beyond that. That's all I ask." The mayor clapped him on the shoulder. "He'll be at the Silver Dollar around noon. And speaking of noon, Katherine mentioned the library would be open today if you're interested." Preston glanced at the schoolhouse. "Maybe after I speak with Parker." Mayor Miller smiled knowingly, but said nothing more. At noon, Preston found himself back at the Silver Dollar, now transformed from an evening saloon to a daytime meeting place where men gathered for lunch and business discussions. James Parker was easy to spot, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a silver-streaked beard and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades under the open sky. Their conversation was straightforward. Parker needed someone who understood cattle and could manage the 20 hands who worked his North Range, 10 miles from town. The previous foreman had moved east to care for his ailing parents. The job came with a cabin, good pay, and a share of the profits. "I don't need an answer today," Parker said as they shook hands. "Take a ride out tomorrow, see the place, then decide. Been running cattle in this valley for 18 years and never lost a herd to drought or rustlers. Good land, good water, good men." Preston promised to consider it. As he left the saloon, his steps turned almost of their own accord toward the small brick building with a sign that read, "Whisper Creek Library and Reading Room." The interior was cool and quiet, with shelves lining the walls and tables in the center where two elderly men sat reading newspapers. Katherine stood on a small ladder, shelving books. She wore the same practical blue dress as the day before, but her hair was coming loose from its pins, with wisps framing her face as she stretched to reach a high shelf. She turned at the sound of the door and smiled when she saw him. "Mr. Fletcher, you decided to take me up on my offer after all." "Preston, please," he said, echoing her words from the previous evening. Katherine descended the ladder with a grace that belied its rickety appearance. "What can I help you find today, Preston?" He glanced around at the modest but well-organized collection. "Do you have any Twain?" She led him to a shelf near the window. "We have The Innocents Abroad and a collection of his shorter works." She pulled a volume from the shelf and handed it to him. "Though if you enjoy Twain, you might also appreciate Bret Harte. His stories of the West are quite engaging." Preston took the book, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I trust your judgment. I haven't had much time for reading these past few years." "Then you have a lot of catching up to do," Katherine said, selecting another volume. Life without books is a poor substitute for living. They talked about literature for nearly an hour, moving from Twain to Dickens to Whitman. Katherine's knowledge was impressive but never pretentious, and Preston found himself sharing opinions he hadn't articulated in years. It was the longest conversation he'd had with anyone in longer than he could remember, and certainly the most enjoyable. "I should get back to the schoolhouse," Katherine said eventually, glancing at the clock on the wall. "The children will be returning from their lunch soon." Preston nodded, suddenly reluctant to end their conversation. "Could I borrow these?" he asked, holding up the 2 books she'd recommended. "Of course." She recorded his name in a ledger. "They're due back in 2 weeks, but come by sooner if you finish them. I'd love to hear what you think." As she walked him to the door, Katherine hesitated. "There's a social at the church on Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just food and conversation. You'd be welcome to join us." "I'll consider it," Preston said, more tempted than he would have expected. Outside, the bright sunlight felt jarring after the cool dimness of the library. Preston tucked the books under his arm and walked back to Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, his mind full of Katherine's animated explanations of why Huckleberry Finn was a work of genius despite its controversial nature. The next morning, Preston rode out with James Parker to see the North Range. The valley opened up beyond the town, revealing rolling grasslands dotted with cattle and bordered by gentle hills. The foreman's cabin was simple but solid, with 2 rooms and a front porch that faced the sunrise. The cowhands were a mix of veterans and younger men, all competent and respectful. As they rode back toward town in the afternoon, Preston found himself already thinking of improvements to the corrals and planning the fall roundup. The land felt right under Thunder's hooves, the air clean in his lungs, the endless sky a promise rather than a burden. And he certainly hadn't planned to be thinking about a schoolteacher with honey blonde hair and opinions on everything from Shakespeare to cattle breeding. Saturday arrived clear and warm. Preston spent the morning at Parker's ranch, familiarizing himself with the operation. By late afternoon, he was back in town, standing in front of the small mirror in his boarding house room, attempting to tame his dark hair and trim his beard into something more presentable. The church social was already underway when he arrived. Tables laden with food lined the churchyard, and lanterns hung from tree branches, waiting for dusk to fall. Children ran between the adults, playing tag and shrieking with laughter. A fiddler and a banjo player provided music from the church steps. Preston spotted Katherine immediately. She wore a dress of deep green that brought out her eyes, and her hair was arranged more elaborately than he'd seen before, with small flowers woven into the braids. She was speaking with an older woman, her hands moving expressively as she made some point. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up and saw him. A smile spread across her face, and she excused herself from her conversation to make her way toward him. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. Preston nodded. "I finished the Hart book. Thought I should return it and tell you that you were right. His descriptions of mining towns are remarkably accurate." Katherine laughed. "You didn't need to dress up and attend a social just to return a book. The library has a drop box." "Maybe I had other reasons," Preston said, surprising himself with his boldness. A faint blush colored Katherine's cheeks. "Well, I'm glad, whatever your reasons. Have you eaten? Mrs. Miller's fried chicken is legendary in these parts." She led him to the food tables, introducing him to townspeople along the way. Everyone seemed to know her and regard her with genuine affection. Preston observed how she remembered details about each person, asking about an elderly man's rheumatism, congratulating a young couple on their new baby, praising a shy child for her reading progress. As they filled their plates, Preston asked, "How did you end up teaching in Whisper Creek? You mentioned Illinois before." Katherine nodded, leading him to a quieter spot under an oak tree. "I grew up near Chicago. My father was a professor, my mother a teacher before her marriage. Education was always valued in our home." She looked thoughtful. "After they both died influenza, 3 years apart, I found myself with an education but few prospects. Teaching positions for women were scarce in the city, but out west, towns were desperate for qualified teachers. So you came here?" "Not directly. I taught in Nebraska for a year, but the conditions were—" She hesitated. "Challenging." "Then I saw an advertisement for a position here. The salary was better, and they promised a proper schoolhouse rather than a converted barn." Preston smiled. "And 5 years later, you're still here." "5 years later, I'm still here," she agreed. "I've watched children learn to read, seen the town grow, helped start this library. It became home when I wasn't looking." There was something in her expression that resonated with Preston's own experiences, the surprise of finding belonging after expecting only temporary shelter. "I took the foreman position at Parker's ranch," he told her. "Moving out to the cabin next week." Katherine's smile brightened. "That's wonderful news. James Parker is a good man to work for, and that North Range is beautiful country." "It is," Preston agreed, thinking of the rolling grasslands and the cabin with its view of the sunrise. "I hadn't planned to stay anywhere for long, but sometimes places choose us instead of the other way around," Katherine finished for him. Their conversation flowed easily as twilight fell and the lanterns were lit. They talked about books and ranching, about Katherine's students and Preston's travels across the West. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Preston hesitated, then extended his hand. "Would you care to dance, Katherine?" Her eyes sparkled in the lantern light. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't ask." Preston hadn't danced in years, but his body remembered the steps. Katherine moved gracefully in his arms, her hand warm in his, her face tilted up to his with a smile that made his heart race. As they turned beneath the stars, with the music wrapping around them and the soft murmur of the town at their backs, Preston felt something shift inside him, a settling. Like pieces of himself that had been scattered by loneliness were finally finding their way home. The days that followed took on a rhythm unlike any Preston had known before. During the week, he worked at the ranch, learning the land and the cattle, earning the respect of the hands through his knowledge and fair treatment. He moved into the foreman's cabin, making small improvements: a bookshelf here, a comfortable chair there, a garden plot behind the house. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, he rode into town for supplies and invariably found his way to the library, where Katherine would recommend books and debate their merits with him. On Saturdays, he attended whatever social gatherings were happening: church picnics, barn dances, town meetings, always looking for Katherine's honey blonde hair in the crowd, always finding his way to her side. As summer gave way to fall, their friendship deepened into something more. Preston found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about: his failed ranch, his partner's death, the gradual severing of ties with his family back east. Katherine spoke of her lonely childhood as an only child of older parents, her struggle to be taken seriously as an educated woman, her dreams of someday opening a proper school with multiple teachers and courses in science and mathematics alongside reading and writing. Their first kiss came on a crisp October evening. Preston had escorted Katherine home from a harvest festival, their breaths forming small clouds in the cool air. On her front porch, beneath a sky scattered with stars, she had looked up at him with those clear green eyes, and he had finally given in to the longing that had been building for months. Her lips were soft and warm, her body fitting against his as if made for him. When they pulled apart, Katherine's eyes were shining, and Preston knew with sudden certainty that the emptiness inside him had been waiting for her all along. "I think I've been looking for you my whole life," he said quietly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Katherine leaned into his touch. "Then I'm glad you found me." Winter arrived with swirling snow and bitter winds that howled across the valley. Preston's days were filled with the challenges of keeping cattle alive through the harsh weather, riding fence lines in freezing temperatures, and ensuring the hands had enough supplies to last until the roads cleared. Katherine's school remained open despite the weather, with children arriving on horseback or in sleds, bundled against the cold. On the worst days, when travel was impossible, Preston found himself in his cabin, reading by lamplight and writing letters to Katherine that he delivered when the paths cleared. Christmas brought the entire town together at the church, where a towering pine tree was decorated with candles and handmade ornaments. Preston presented Katherine with a carved wooden box he'd made during the long evenings alone, its lid inlaid with a design of books and flowers. Inside was a delicate silver locket he'd ordered from a catalog months earlier. Katherine's eyes filled with tears as she opened it. "It's beautiful," she whispered, turning so he could fasten it around her neck. Her gift to him was a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen. "For all those thoughts you have when you're alone on the range," she said, "so you can share them with me later." That night, standing in the gently falling snow outside her small house, Preston held her close and knew that the time for solitude had passed. "I love you, Katherine," he said, the words forming easily after years of never saying them to anyone. One evening in early April, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and crimson, Preston took her hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his heart pounding with nervousness he hadn't felt since their first dance. Katherine looked at him with those perceptive green eyes. "That sounds dangerous," she teased. Preston smiled, drawing strength from her warmth. "There's land for sale adjoining Parker's property, good grazing land with a creek running through it. Parker's willing to sell me some of his stock to start my own herd. It wouldn't be a large operation at first, but with care and time, it could grow." Katherine's hand tightened in his. "You're thinking of starting your own ranch?" "I am," he nodded. "And I'm thinking it would be awfully lonely doing it by myself." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Preston," he knelt before her, still holding her hand. "Katherine Prescott, I came to Whisper Creek looking for nothing more than a brief respite from loneliness. Instead, I found everything I never knew I needed. I found a home, a purpose, and most importantly, I found you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring with a small diamond. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes. Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love that had grown in his heart since that first day in the Silver Dollar Saloon. Their wedding took place in June, with the entire town in attendance. The church was decorated with wildflowers, and Katherine wore a dress of cream-colored silk that made her look like a vision from a dream. Mayor Miller performed the ceremony, his voice thick with emotion as Preston and Katherine exchanged vows they had written themselves. I wandered for years, searching for something I couldn't name, Preston said, holding Catherine's hands in his. Now I know I was looking for you, for your mind that challenges me, your heart that understands me, your spirit that inspires me. With you, I am home no matter where we are. Catherine's voice was steady despite the tears in her eyes. You rode into town when I had stopped believing in romantic notions, when I had convinced myself that books and teaching were enough. You reminded me that life is meant to be shared, that love can arrive unexpectedly and change everything. I promise to love you through whatever comes, to build a life with you that is rich with meaning and joy. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers erupted from the assembled townsfolk. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting and toasts to the couple who had found each other against all odds. The land Preston had mentioned became their ranch, the Sunrise Ranch, named for the view that greeted them each morning from their newly built home. It was modest at first, just 100 head of cattle and the house they had designed together, with extra rooms for the children they hoped would come and a special corner for Catherine's ever-growing library. Katherine continued teaching for the first year of their marriage, riding to town each morning and back to the ranch each evening. When the school board finally agreed to hire a second teacher, she reduced her hours to 3 days a week, allowing her more time to help with the ranch and pursue her own educational initiatives, evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading or mathematics skills, correspondence courses for advanced students, and a book club that quickly became the social highlight of the month for many of the town's women. Preston's ranching skills, combined with Catherine's organizational abilities and financial acumen, made the Sunrise Ranch a growing success. By the end of their first year of marriage, they had doubled their herd and hired 2 full-time hands. By the second year, they had added a barn and expanded their grazing lands. Their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth after Catherine's mother, arrived in their 3rd year of marriage. Preston was transformed by fatherhood, carrying his daughter around the ranch, showing her the cattle and horses, reading to her from Catherine's books long before she could understand the words. She's going to be as smart as her mother, he would say proudly as Elizabeth babbled and reached for the pages. Katherine would smile, watching them together, and as kind as her father. Their son, James, named for both Preston's father and James Parker, who had become a mentor and friend, followed 2 years later. Their family felt complete, a boy and a girl, a home filled with books and laughter, a ranch that provided not just a living but a legacy. Life was not without its challenges. There was a drought in their 5th year that threatened the herd, a bout of scarlet fever that swept through the town and kept Katherine working day and night at the school-turned-infirmary, a fire that destroyed half their barn one harsh winter. But through it all, Preston and Katherine faced each obstacle together, their love deepening with each challenge overcome. On the 10th anniversary of Preston's arrival in Whisper Creek, they hosted a celebration at the ranch. The town had grown over the decade, with new businesses and homes spreading beyond the original boundaries, but it retained the sense of community that had first welcomed a lonely cowboy riding in at sunset. As twilight fell, Preston found Katherine standing at the edge of their property, looking out over the land they had nurtured together. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Katherine leaned back against him. "Completely. You. More than I ever imagined possible." He turned her gently to face him. 10 years ago, I rode into town looking for nothing more than a brief escape from loneliness. I had no idea I was riding toward everything that would ever matter to me." Katherine smiled, reaching up to touch his face, tracing the laugh lines that had replaced the creases of solitude. "And I had no idea that a dusty cowboy with a love for Mark Twain would change my entire life. For the better, I hope," Preston teased. For the better, she confirmed, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. Definitely for the better. Behind them, their children's laughter mingled with the sounds of their friends and neighbors enjoying the celebration. Ahead of them stretched years of shared dreams and quiet moments, of challenges and triumphs, of love that had transformed two solitary lives into a journey shared. As the stars began to appear in the vast western sky, Preston held Katherine close, grateful beyond words for the twist of fate that had led him to Whisper Creek, to her, to this life that had surpassed his most hopeful dreams. The loneliness that had once been his constant companion was now just a distant memory, replaced by a fullness of heart that sustained him through each day. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I love you too," Katherine answered. "Forever." And in that moment, under the endless starry sky, with the ranch they had built together spreading out around them and the sounds of their life's blessings in the background, Preston knew with absolute certainty that he had found what he had been searching for all along, not just an end to solitude, but a beginning of something infinitely more precious. He had found his forever in Katherine's eyes, in their children's laughter, in the home they had created together. And that, he knew, was the greatest treasure the West or any place on earth could ever offer.